Good evening. We're in the mountains of Campbell County, Tennessee, where 22 federal revenue agents disappeared without a trace. They came here after a raid that burned out the Caldwell family's Moonshine stills, a clan that has made...
Between October 18th and November 12th, 1,931, 22 federal revenue agents disappeared across a 120-mile stretch of southwestern Virginia mountains, vanishing from their enforcement operations, their temporary command posts, their vehicles abandoned on remote roads where Caldwell Clan territory had been declared off-limits to government interference since 1865. By November 20th, all 22 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark every still site where agents had confiscated equipment worth $50,000. 3 generations of copper and tools that represented the Caldwell family's Moonshine empire built over 60 years. The perpetrators were members of the Caldwell Clan, a network of 47 family members spanning 4 generations led by patriarch Luther Caldwell, who'd watched revenue agents destroy in 1 week what his grandfather had established in 1,870 seconds. Who'd seen enough of his family's heritage burned and confiscated that he'd decided federal government's war on mountain whiskey would cost Washington more agents than they were willing to sacrifice. The Treasury Department would classify it as the deadliest massacre of federal agents in American history, exceeding any previous losses to bootleggers or organized crime. But the motive wasn't protecting criminal enterprise from legitimate law enforcement. It was a mountain family defending economic survival against government that had criminalized their primary income source, that had destroyed equipment irreplaceable during Depression, that had declared war on Appalachian culture by prohibiting whiskey-making tradition that predated federal authority by a century. If you're ready to hear how the largest Moonshine clan in Virginia systematically eliminated an entire revenue enforcement operation, hit that subscribe button. But understand, this story contains a dramatized account of mass murder of federal agents during Prohibition's final year. Franklin County, Virginia, occupied 712 square miles of Blue Ridge mountain foothills in 1931. Wedged between Roanoke and the North Carolina border, populated by 30,000 people, including hundreds of Moonshine families who'd been distilling since colonial times. The county was so notorious for illegal whiskey that newspapers called it Moonshine Capital of the World, estimated that 99% of adult males were involved in production or distribution, that more illegal alcohol came from Franklin County than any comparable area in America. October 1931 meant Prohibition entering its final years, though repeal wouldn't come until 1933, federal enforcement intensifying as Treasury Department tried to demonstrate control before legal alcohol eliminated justification for revenue agent positions. Temperatures were dropping into 40s at night, perfect for running stills that required cold water for condensing vapor. Harvest season meant abundant corn for mash, and mountains were brilliant with fall colors that would soon give way to bare trees, offering less cover for operations that needed concealment. The Caldwell clan controlled approximately 40 square miles of Franklin County's most remote territory, area so isolated that even county sheriff rarely ventured there, where a family had operated stills continuously since Luther Caldwell's grandfather established first operation in 1872. The clan, by 1931, consisted of 47 members spanning Patriarch Luther, age 71, down to great-grandchildren in their teens, all involved in various aspects of moonshine production, from tending stills to hauling supplies to distributing finished product. They operated 11 major stills simultaneously, produced approximately 8,000 gallons monthly, supplied distributors throughout Virginia and into neighboring states, generated income that supported entire extended family during Depression when legal employment barely existed in rural Appalachia. Luther Caldwell was born September 3rd, 1860, in cabin his grandfather had built near what became known as Caldwell Hollow. Raised learning whiskey-making craft from age 8 when he'd started tending fires and monitoring temperatures. His grandfather Samuel had fought for Confederacy, had returned from war, understanding that economic survival in defeated South required resourcefulness and willingness to operate outside systems controlled by federal government that had destroyed their world. Samuel had established Moonshine operation using skills learned from Scots-Irish ancestors, had passed knowledge to his son William, who'd expanded operations and taught Luther, who'd further expanded and was now teaching fourth generation. The Caldwell operation by 1931 represented 60 years of accumulated knowledge, equipment purchased or fabricated across 3 generations, customer relationships built through decades of consistent quality, reputation for producing finest corn whiskey in Virginia. The Clan's equipment was extraordinary by mountain standards. Included copper pot stills custom fabricated in 1,890 seconds when purchasing copper was legal. Elaborate cooling systems using mountain spring water piped through hand-carved wooden channels. Storage facilities built into caves that maintain perfect temperature and humidity. The equipment was worth approximately $50,000 based on copper value and skilled craftsmanship required to fabricate stills that produced consistent quality. But equipment's true value was cultural and familial, represented generations of knowledge and labor, constituted heritage that couldn't be measured in dollars. Destroying Caldwell equipment wouldn't just eliminate criminal operation, would erase 60 years of family history and economic foundations supporting 47 people who had no alternative income sources during Depression. Federal revenue enforcement had intensified throughout Franklin County during 1931. Treasury Department assigning regional supervisor named James Patterson to eliminate moonshine operations through aggressive raids that destroyed equipment rather than just arresting operators who'd be replaced immediately. Patterson had transferred from Chicago, where he'd worked against organized crime bootleggers, believed Appalachian moonshiners were rural criminals deserving same aggressive tactics used against Al Capone's organization. He'd assembled a team of 30 agents, established temporary headquarters in Rocky Mount, the county seat, planned systematic campaign to destroy every major still in Franklin County, starting with largest operations like Caldwell Clan's empire. Patterson's campaign began October 11th, 1931. With raid on Caldwell's primary, still an isolated hollow accessible only by trail, too narrow for vehicles. 20 agents hiked 3 miles carrying sledgehammers and axes, arrived at dawn expecting to find operation running with minimal security, found instead elaborate facility protected by family members who'd been warned hours earlier about planned raid. The agents destroyed the still anyway. Smashed copper pots that had been fabricated 40 years earlier, poured out 300 gallons of finished whiskey, burned wooden structures, hauled away what copper they could carry as evidence and to prevent rebuilding. The destruction took 4 hours, eliminated equipment worth $10,000, operation that had produced 800 gallons monthly supporting dozen family members. Luther Caldwell watched from ridgeline above the hollow, had evacuated his relatives before agents arrived, understood that fighting 20 armed federal agents would result in deaths that weren't worth defending single operation when Clan operated 10 others. But watching equipment his father had built being destroyed triggered rage that decades of revenue harassment hadn't produced. Understanding that Patterson intended to eliminate every Caldwell still represented existential threat that required response beyond relocating operations or bribing local law enforcement who had no authority over federal agents. The raids continued systematically through mid-October, Patterson's agents destroying one Caldwell still every 2 days, seizing copper and hauling it away, making arrests that resulted in brief jail terms before operators returned to find their equipment destroyed beyond repair. By October 18th, Patterson had eliminated 5 of 11 Caldwell operations, confiscated copper worth $25,000, effectively cut Clan's production capacity by half. The remaining 6 stills were deeper in mountains, accessible only by trails that required all-day hikes, locations Patterson planned to raid once he'd secured additional agents and pack animals to haul confiscated equipment. Luther gathered the clan on October 18th at family compound built around his grandfather's original cabin, 47 members representing 4 generations who'd worked Caldwell stills since childhood. He told them Patterson intended to destroy every operation, that federal government's campaign wouldn't end until Caldwell family was eliminated from moonshine business completely, that accepting destruction meant poverty and starvation during Depression when no legal alternatives existed. He told them that 5 stills were already gone, that equipment couldn't be replaced because copper was expensive and fabrication required skills few possessed, that remaining stills would be destroyed within weeks if campaign continued. And he told them he'd researched Patterson's operation, had identified all 30 agents working Franklin County raids, had discovered their schedules and vulnerabilities, had concluded that systematic elimination of entire enforcement team was only response that would stop campaign and demonstrate that destroying Caldwell heritage carried consequences federal government hadn't anticipated. The family debated for hours, younger members arguing they should fight back when outnumbered, older members suggesting they could relocate operations to other counties or states where enforcement wasn't as aggressive. But Luther insisted that running meant surrendering territory, his grandfather had claimed, meant admitting federal government could destroy mountain families through administrative violence disguised as law enforcement. He explained that killing 22 agents would trigger massive retaliation, would probably result in deaths or imprisonment for many Klan members, might destroy family completely, but allowing Patterson to eliminate their operations would definitely destroy them economically, would leave 47 people without income during Depression, would betray heritage they'd defended for 60 years. 23 adult males volunteered immediately, understood they were committing to mass murder of federal agents, accepted that consequences would be severe, but believed defending family heritage justified any risk. They spent next 3 days planning systematic elimination, divided agents into groups based on their assignments and locations, coordinated attacks that would eliminate all targets within 3 weeks before pattern became obvious and security increased. They knew terrain intimately, had networks throughout county who'd warn of agent movements, had weapons accumulated over generations including hunting rifles, accurate at distances that made counterattack difficult, had determination born from watching family heritage destroyed by government that had criminalized economic survival. The first agent died October 21st. Revenue agent Thomas Mitchell shot while hiking alone toward suspected still location, killed by sniper firing from concealed position 800 yards away. Body found 3 days later when he failed to return from patrol. Second and third agents died October 23rd during 2-man patrol of Caldwell territory, ambushed on trail by multiple shooters, eliminated before either could draw weapons or radio for help. Patterson initially believed attacks were defending active stills, didn't recognize beginning of systematic elimination of his entire team, increased security but didn't suspend operations, believing aggressive enforcement would intimidate moonshiners into cooperation. The pattern continued through late October, 1 or 2 agents disappearing every 2 days, Bodies found in remote locations days after deaths, always shot from distances suggesting skilled marksmen using hunting rifles, always in areas where Caldwell family operated or had operated before recent raids. By October 31st, 8 agents were dead. Patterson understood his team was being hunted, requested reinforcements from Treasury Department, who sent 12 additional agents, bringing total to 34. But reinforcements arrived unfamiliar with terrain, dependent on local guides who often belonged to families sympathetic to moonshiners, vulnerable to ambushes in mountains where Caldwell Clan had operated for 60 years. Patterson attempted to continue raids despite losses, believed showing weakness would embolden moonshiners throughout region, that suspending enforcement would make his agents' deaths meaningless. But each raid risked additional casualties. Agents increasingly reluctant to hike into isolated areas where snipers might be positioned. Morale declining as they understood they were hunting family that had home field advantage and community support. Additional agents died throughout early November, picked off individually or in small groups. Systematic elimination that demonstrated Caldwell Clan could strike anywhere in their territory regardless of security precautions. Treasury Department ordered Patterson to suspend raids on November 9th, withdrew all agents to Rocky Mount headquarters, began planning evacuation from Franklin County until military support could be arranged. But even withdrawal couldn't protect agents who remained targets as long as they stayed in Virginia. 4 agents died November 10th when their vehicles were ambushed on highway outside Rocky Mount, attacked with rifles and shotguns by multiple shooters who disappeared into mountains before local law enforcement could respond. 3 more died November 11th in coordinated attacks on temporary housing where agents had been staying, shooters approaching at night and firing through windows before vanishing into darkness. By November 12th, 22 agents were dead. Entire enforcement operation that had destroyed 5 Caldwell stills had been systematically eliminated, surviving agents evacuated under military escort to Richmond, where they remained until formal investigation concluded. Treasury Department declared Franklin County too dangerous for revenue operations, suspended all moonshine enforcement in southwestern Virginia pending investigation and reassessment of tactics. The Caldwell Clan had achieved what no bootleggers or organized crime figures had accomplished during Prohibition. They'd driven federal agents out of their territory completely through violence that made enforcement costs exceed any conceivable benefit. FBI investigation deployed 100 agents to Franklin County, established command posts with military security, offered $50,000 reward for information leading to arrests. But mountain communities remained silent, refused to cooperate with investigation, understood that Caldwell family had defended their territory and heritage, that federal government's campaign had been war on Appalachian culture rather than legitimate law enforcement. Grand jury was convened, hundreds interviewed, 0 indictments issued because no witnesses would testify, and physical evidence linked no specific individuals to killings that had occurred in remote areas without surveillance. Luther Caldwell was arrested November 20th on charges of conspiring to murder federal agents, held without bail, pending trial that everyone expected would fail without witnesses. His attorney argued prosecution had no evidence beyond circumstantial association between Caldwell Clan's territory and locations where agents had died, that proving conspiracy required testimony linking Luther to planning or ordering killings, that federal government couldn't prosecute based solely on suspicion that Klan had defended their operations. Trial in March 1932 lasted 2 weeks, featured no witnesses connecting Luther to violence, resulted in acquittal that essentially confirmed federal government couldn't prosecute Caldwell Clan without community cooperation that would never materialize. The acquittal triggered reforms in federal revenue enforcement, Treasury Department concluding that aggressive campaigns destroying family operations created violence that was counterproductive, that Appalachian moonshining required different approach than organized crime in cities. New policies emphasized arrests over equipment destruction, fines over imprisonment, cooperation with local authorities who understood mountain culture over federal agents imposing Chicago tactics on Virginia hollows. Enforcement in Franklin County resumed cautiously in 1933, focused on larger commercial operations rather than family stills. Avoided Caldwell territory completely under informal understanding that Clan wouldn't be prosecuted if they kept operations small and didn't sell outside Virginia. Prohibitions repealed December 1933 eliminated most federal interest in moonshine enforcement. Legal alcohol becoming available meant illegal whiskey was profitable only for those avoiding taxes rather than prohibition itself. Caldwell Clan continued operating through 1932 and beyond. Rebuilt, destroyed stills using salvaged copper and fabricated replacements. Maintained production that supplied customers preferring untaxed whiskey to commercial products. Luther died in 1945 at age 85. Had successfully defended family heritage through violence that cost 22 agents their lives, and had forced federal government to acknowledge that some communities couldn't be controlled through aggressive enforcement that ignored cultural context. The deeper legacy persists in debates about federal authority versus local sovereignty, about whether government has right to criminalize economic activities that communities have practiced for generations, about what tactics are appropriate when enforcement triggers violent resistance from families defending survival rather than criminal profits. The Caldwell case demonstrated that federal power has limits when communities refuse cooperation, that violence can successfully resist government overreach when population supports resistors, that sometimes protecting heritage requires actions that make defenders themselves criminals by federal definition, even if their communities view them as heroes. The years following Luther's acquittal transformed Caldwell Clan operations from defensive war against federal government into calculated adaptation to changing legal environment where prohibitions approaching repeal would eliminate criminal prohibition but maintain tax enforcement requiring different strategies. Luther returned to Franklin County in April 1932, understanding that massive retaliation he'd expected hadn't materialized, that Treasury Department had concluded prosecuting Appalachian moonshiners required community cooperation that would never exist after massacre had made Caldwell Clan heroes throughout southwestern Virginia. The federal government's decision to effectively cede territory represented unprecedented acknowledgement that some populations couldn't be controlled through force, that enforcing unpopular laws against armed communities defending cultural practices required costs federal budget couldn't sustain. Luther rebuilt destroyed stills immediately after acquittal, used connections throughout Virginia Moonshine Network to obtain copper and fabrication assistance from families who'd survived their own conflicts with revenue agents. The rebuilding was cautious initially. Operations kept smaller to avoid attracting federal attention. Production focused on local markets rather than interstate distribution that might trigger renewed enforcement. But by summer 1932, Caldwell Clan was operating 9 stills, producing approximately 6,000 gallons monthly, reduction from pre-massacre 11 stills and 8,000 gallons, but sufficient to support family and maintain market presence that had been established over 60 years. The reconstruction included security improvements that previous operations had lacked, recognition that federal government might resume enforcement if Clan appeared vulnerable or careless. Luther established rotating guard schedules around active stills, positioned lookouts on trails leading to production sites, created early warning system using signal fires visible across mountains that would alert operators to approaching threats. He organized clan members into specialized roles beyond simple production, designated defensive teams trained in ambush tactics that had eliminated 22 agents, maintained weapons caches at strategic locations throughout territory. The security measures weren't paranoia but realistic assessment that violence which had driven federal agents from Franklin County had also marked Caldwell Clan as dangerous organization requiring military-style defenses against any future enforcement attempts. Prohibition's repeal on December 5th, 1933, eliminated federal criminal prohibition of alcohol but maintained tax requirements that meant moonshining remained illegal for those avoiding federal excise taxes. Luther understood immediately that repeal would reduce market for illegal whiskey as legal alternatives became available, that Caldwell operations would need to compete on quality and price against commercial distilleries that could advertise openly and distribute through legitimate channels. He focused on premium production techniques passed down through 3 generations, emphasized craft quality that commercial operations couldn't match, marketed Caldwell whiskey as authentic mountain product made with traditional methods rather than mass-produced alcohol from corporate distilleries. The strategy succeeded because significant customer base valued authenticity and quality over legality, preferred untaxed whiskey that cost less than commercial products even if purchasing it remained technically illegal. Caldwell Clan maintained steady demand throughout 1,930 seconds, found that legal whiskey's availability actually helped their business by creating comparison that demonstrated their product's superiority. Customers who tried both often returned to Caldwell whiskey, appreciated smooth flavor that came from copper stills and mountain spring water and aging processes that commercial operations rushed to maximize profits. Luther's gamble that quality would maintain markets despite legalization proved correct, kept family economically viable through Depression decade when employment opportunities remained scarce throughout Appalachia. But post-repeal environment also brought new competitors, bootleggers from other regions who'd survived Prohibition and were now fighting for reduced market, where legal alcohol had eliminated casual consumers. Franklin County became battleground between established families like Caldwells and outsiders trying to establish operations in territory that had proven profitable. The competition occasionally turned violent. Territorial disputes that echoed clan warfare from earlier eras. Conflicts that local law enforcement largely ignored because sheriffs understood intervening in moonshine wars meant choosing sides in feuds that could last generations. The most serious conflict came in August 1936 when Henderson family from neighboring Patrick County attempted to establish stills in southwestern corner of Caldwell territory, area Luther's grandfather had claimed in 1,870 seconds, but that Henderson clan argued was uncontrolled space where any family could operate. The dispute escalated over 3 months, beginning with verbal warnings and progressing to still sabotage and finally to violence when Henderson brothers refused to withdraw from area they insisted wasn't exclusively Caldwell property. Luther was 76 years old in 1936, no longer personally involved in enforcement but still commanding Klan's defensive operations through his sons and grandsons who'd learned from the 1931 massacre that systematic violence achieved objectives that negotiation couldn't. The Henderson War began September 14th, 1936, when Caldwell scouts discovered Henderson operation running in hollow 2 miles from established Caldwell Still. Luther sent his oldest son, Marcus, age 52, to demand Henderson family cease operations and withdraw from Caldwell territory. Henderson Patriarch Clayton, 63, refused, argued his family had operated in Franklin County for 40 years and had equal right to unclaimed territory, that Caldwells couldn't monopolize entire southwestern quadrant of county. Marcus returned to compound, reporting Henderson family wasn't intimidating easily, that Clayton had implied his 4 sons and dozen grandchildren working stills were prepared to defend their operation violently if necessary. Luther convened family meeting that night, explained Henderson. Incursion represented test of whether Caldwell Clan still controlled territory they defended in 1931. That allowing Henderson operation to continue would invite other families to establish competing stills throughout area Clan had monopolized for 60 years. He was too old to personally participate in violence, but his sons and grandsons understood implications, that responding weakly would undermine authority their family had maintained through willingness to use force that others wouldn't match. 21 Caldwell men volunteered for what they understood would be systematic campaign to eliminate Henderson operation and punish family for challenging territorial control. The campaign began September 18th when Caldwell team destroyed Henderson still while operators were absent, smashed copper and burned structures, left message explaining Henderson family had been warned to withdraw, and that continuing to operate would result in escalating consequences. Henderson's response was defiant, Clayton publicly declaring his family wouldn't be intimidated by threats, that Caldwells had no legal claim to territory where Henderson operation was located. He rebuilt still within week, positioned armed guards to prevent future sabotage, prepared for conflict he believed Caldwell family was too cautious to pursue given their 1,931 experience had nearly resulted in Luther's imprisonment. Clayton had miscalculated how thoroughly the 1,931 massacre had demonstrated that Caldwell Clan would accept severe consequences rather than surrender control. On September 28th, 3 Henderson guards were shot by snipers positioned on ridges surrounding their still, killed before they could return fire or alert family members working production site. The killings were deliberate escalation, message that Caldwell Clan would eliminate Henderson family members systematically if territory dispute continued. Clayton understood he faced choice between withdrawing or engaging in war his family would likely lose given Caldwell numbers and established territorial advantages. The Henderson family withdrew October 2nd, dismantled their remaining equipment, relocated operations to Patrick County where they wouldn't compete with Caldwell territory. Clayton negotiated peace through intermediaries, acknowledged Caldwell control over disputed area, paid compensation for the 3 deaths that had resulted from his family's attempted incursion. The conflict had lasted 19 days, resulted in 3 Henderson deaths and 0 Caldwell casualties. Demonstrated that lessons from 1,931 massacre remained applicable in territorial disputes between Moonshine families. Luther had proven that violence, which had driven federal agents from Franklin County, could also eliminate competing families who challenged clans' territorial control. But the Henderson War also revealed vulnerabilities in Luther's leadership as he aged past 75. Questions about succession and whether next generation could maintain authority he'd established through 6 decades of successful operations and strategic violence. Luther's 4 sons were capable operators who understood moonshine, craft, and territorial defense, but none possessed his combination of business acumen and willingness to authorize violence that achieved objectives regardless of consequences. Marcus was steady but unimaginative. Thomas was aggressive but impulsive. William was cautious to point of passivity. And Daniel, who'd been 19 during 1931 massacre, was now 24 and eager to prove himself, but lacked experience and judgment that came from surviving decades of conflicts. Luther began formal succession planning in 1937, understanding he wouldn't live many more years and that failure to establish clear leadership would fragment family into competing factions. He designated Marcus as primary heir, responsible for overall operations and strategic decisions, Thomas as security commander, managing territorial defense and enforcement, William as production manager, overseeing still operations and quality control, and Daniel as distribution coordinator, handling customer relationships and market development. The structure divided responsibilities while maintaining unity under Marcus's leadership, designed to prevent conflicts between brothers that could destroy family cohesion after Luther's death. The succession plan was tested in March 1940 when Luther suffered stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to actively manage operations. Marcus assumed leadership at age 56, found himself responsible for a clan of 49 members operating 8 stills, producing 5,500 gallons monthly, generating income, supporting entire extended family as America emerged from depression toward wartime economy that would create new opportunities and challenges. Marcus's first major decision was whether to expand production to meet anticipated wartime demand or maintain conservative operations that had proven sustainable through 1,930 seconds. Marcus chose expansion, understood that World War II would create industrial boom, increasing demand for alcohol, both legal and illegal, that military deployment would reduce law enforcement's capacity for revenue enforcement, that wartime rationing might limit legal alcohol availability, creating opportunities for untaxed whiskey. He increased production to 7,000 gallons monthly by establishing 2 new stills and upgrading existing operations with improved equipment purchased using profits accumulated during late Depression years. The expansion proved prescient as wartime economy generated customers with disposable income and reduced availability of commercial products, Caldwell whiskey finding markets among industrial workers and military personnel stationed throughout Virginia. But wartime also brought challenges as federal government devoted resources to war effort and became less tolerant of activities that undermined tax revenue needed for military spending. Revenue enforcement increased in 1942 despite reduced agent numbers, raids becoming more aggressive as Treasury departments sought to maximize tax collection from both legal and illegal alcohol. Franklin County experienced renewed federal attention, though agents carefully avoided Caldwell territory. Memory of 1,931 massacre, ensuring that revenue operations focused on smaller families who hadn't demonstrated willingness to kill federal agents defending their stills. Luther Caldwell died September 15, 1945, at age 85, 2 weeks after Japan surrendered, ending World War II. He'd survived everything 20th century had thrown at Appalachian moonshine families: Prohibition's criminalization of traditional craft, Depression's economic devastation, federal enforcement's aggressive campaigns, territorial wars with competing families, stroke that would have ended most men's lives years earlier. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners from throughout southwestern Virginia, moonshine families and customers and community members who'd known him as patriarch, who'd defended mountain culture against federal overreach. The gathering was remarkable for its openness, federal agents and local law enforcement attending to pay respects to man they'd pursued for decades, acknowledgement that Luther had become legendary figure whose defiance of government authority had achieved mythical status throughout region. Marcus delivered eulogy describing his father's life as testament to mountain resilience, His willingness to defend family heritage against government that had tried to destroy traditional practices through criminalization and aggressive enforcement. He acknowledged the 22 revenue agents who died in 1931, characterized their deaths as tragic but necessary response to campaign that had threatened Caldwell family's survival, compared Klan's defensive violence to American Revolution's resistance against British government that had imposed unwanted authority on colonial population. The comparison was controversial, but resonated with audience who viewed moonshining as legitimate economic activity that government had no right to prohibit, who saw Caldwell Clan's massacre of federal agents as justified defense of cultural sovereignty against illegitimate federal intrusion. The post-war years brought fundamental transformation to moonshine economics as legal alcohol became abundant, prices fell. Commercial marketing made branded products attractive to consumers who'd previously bought illegal whiskey primarily because it was cheaper. Marcus understood that Caldwell operations needed to adapt or face decline as markets shifted toward legal alternatives that offered convenience and variety that moonshine couldn't match. He reduced production to 5,000 gallons monthly, focused on premium quality that commanded higher prices from customers who valued craft over cost savings, positioned Caldwell whiskey as artisanal product rather than cheap alternative to commercial alcohol. The strategy succeeded initially, but faced increasing pressure through 1,950 seconds as federal enforcement became more sophisticated, agents using vehicles and communications technology that reduced advantages mountain moonshiners had enjoyed during earlier decades when pursuing criminals into remote hollows required days-long expeditions. Raids became more frequent, though, still avoiding direct confrontation with Caldwell Clan, agents understanding that family, which had killed 22 of their predecessors, remained dangerous despite changing technology. But pressure on smaller operations created opening for Caldwell expansion. Family purchasing equipment from moonshiners who were retiring or being prosecuted, consolidating production that maintained families' market dominance even as overall moonshine industry declined. Marcus died in November 1958 at age 74, succeeded by his son Luther Jr., who'd been named after his grandfather and who represented fourth generation of Caldwell moonshiners. Luther Jr. was 38 in 1958. Had been trained in craft since childhood, understood both traditional techniques and modern business practices that 1,950 seconds economy required. He faced challenges his great-grandfather couldn't have imagined. Interstate highway construction opening isolated areas to development, television and radio making mountain culture seem backward compared to prosperous urban lifestyle, young people leaving Appalachia for factory jobs that paid wages moonshining couldn't match. The social transformation threatened to eliminate moonshine not through federal enforcement, but through economic changes that made traditional mountain economy obsolete. Luther Jr.'s response was to modernize operations while maintaining quality traditions that gave Caldwell whiskey its reputation. He incorporated steel components where they improved efficiency without compromising flavor, used automotive parts for pumps and cooling systems, adopted scientific approaches to temperature control and aging that produced more consistent results. But he maintained copper stills for primary distillation, continued using spring water in traditional mash recipes, insisted on aging processes that commercial operations abandoned for faster production. The hybrid approach maintained quality while improving efficiency, allowed Caldwell Clan to compete with legal distilleries on taste while undercutting them on price. The 1,960 seconds brought renewed federal interest in Appalachian Moonshine, Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division launching Operation Dry Up targeting major producers throughout Virginia and neighboring states. The campaign was more sophisticated than 1,931 enforcement agents using surveillance technology and financial investigations rather than simply hiking into mountains to smash stills. They tracked copper purchases and equipment supplies, monitored suspicious cash transactions, recruited informants from within Moonshine communities, build cases that resulted in prosecutions based on conspiracy and tax evasion, rather than just catching operators at active stills. Operation Dry Up devastated Franklin County moonshine industry between 1,963 and 1,967. Dozens of families prosecuted, hundreds of thousands in equipment confiscated, traditional operations becoming too risky as informants and surveillance made concealment nearly impossible. But Caldwell Clan survived relatively untouched. Family security measures and community loyalty preventing infiltration that destroyed other operations. Luther Jr. had learned from 1931 that protecting operations required more than remote locations and armed guards, needed comprehensive counterintelligence identifying potential informants before they could gather evidence, maintaining separation between production and distribution that made proving conspiracy difficult even when agents knew family was operating. The survival came at cost. Constant vigilance that was exhausting and expensive. Paranoia about informants that damaged relationships within community. Isolation that made Caldwell Clan seem like remnant of earlier era rather than viable contemporary business. Luther Jr. watched younger generation of cousins leave for urban jobs. Understood Moonshine had limited future as economic foundation for extended family, began considering whether fourth generation might be last to maintain operations that had sustained Caldwells for nearly a century. The decision became urgent in 1969 when Luther Jr.'s oldest son, Marcus II, age 23, was killed in Vietnam. Body returned to Franklin County for burial that reminded family their heritage was killing and dying in Asian jungles while moonshine operations at home generated decreasing returns from shrinking markets. Luther Jr. gathered remaining family members, 31 by 1970 compared to 47 in 1931, and proposed they begin transitioning away from moonshine toward legal businesses that could sustain family without constant risk of prosecution or violence. The proposal was controversial, older members arguing that abandoning whiskey-making betrayed century of family heritage, younger members countering that maintaining operations had become unsustainable as markets and enforcement both made continuation impractical. The compromise was gradual reduction, maintaining small-scale operations for loyal customers while developing alternative income sources that would eventually replace moonshine entirely. Luther Jr. invested in legitimate businesses throughout 1,970 seconds. Timber operations on family land. Small manufacturing facility producing furniture from local hardwood. Construction company that employed family members in growing housing market. The legal businesses succeeded, generated income that reduced dependence on moonshine, allowed family to maintain operations more as cultural tradition than economic necessity. But tradition proved difficult to abandon completely, moonshine remaining profitable enough and culturally significant enough that complete cessation felt like betrayal of Luther Sr.'s legacy and the 22 agents who died defending family's right to operate. Small-scale production continued through 1,980 seconds and beyond, reduced from multiple stills producing thousands of gallons monthly to single operation producing perhaps 200 gallons for distribution to customers who'd been buying Caldwell whiskey for decades. The production was technically illegal, but essentially tolerated by authorities who understood that prosecuting family that had killed federal agents 50 years earlier would trigger conflict nobody wanted. That symbolic enforcement wasn't worth risking renewed violence over operations that barely registered economically. Luther Jr. died in March 1992 at age 72. Had successfully transitioned family from dependence on moonshine to diversified economy that maintained cultural heritage while eliminating criminal exposure that had defined Caldwell existence for 4 generations. His funeral drew smaller crowd than his grandfather's had. Fewer people remembered 1931 massacre or understood significance of family that had defied federal government so successfully that authorities had effectively surrendered Franklin County territory for decades. But those who attended included elderly revenue agents who'd worked Franklin County in 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, officers who acknowledged that Caldwell Clan had won longer war against federal enforcement, that family's survival through century of pressure represented triumph of local sovereignty over federal authority. The 5th generation faced question that previous generations had never seriously considered. Should Caldwell family continue moonshine operations at all? Marcus III, Luther Jr.'s son, who'd been named after his great-uncle killed by Henderson family in 1936, argued in mid-1990 seconds that moonshine was finished as viable economic activity, that continued operations risked legal business his family had established, that heritage could be honored without maintaining criminal activity that no longer served economic purpose it once had. His cousins disagreed, believed that abandoning whiskey-making completely meant surrendering to federal authority that family had resisted for over a century, that even small-scale operations maintained symbolic